Police. I need to see some ID.
For what? I didn't do anything.
Routine check. Your license and registration?
Fine. Here.
Thank you. Stay right here. Sir, I need to see your ID.
What's this about, officer?
This is a federal warrant. You're coming with me.
Let me see that.
We know he's your contact. Where is he? I don't know what you're talking about. Don't play games. People are in danger. I can't help you. Last chance. Where is he?
The sharp click of handcuffs echoed through the rain-slicked streets of an affluent suburb, locking around the wrists of a man who had dedicated his life to upholding the law with unwavering integrity. Officer Vance Harlan thought he had caught a thug driving a stolen Mercedes through one of the wealthiest zip codes in Illinois. He thought he could bully, brutalize, and lie on his police report without consequence. He was wrong. The man in handcuffs wasn't a criminal, he was a federal judge, and karma had just arrived. The rain came down like a punishment from heaven. Sheets of water slammed against the asphalt of Western Hills with a fury that seemed almost personal. It was late one night, the kind of night where sensible people stayed indoors, where the streets belonged only to those with somewhere urgent to be and those looking for trouble. Officer Vance Harlan was looking for trouble. He sat behind the wheel of Patrol Car Unit 19, parked in his favorite spot, a gravel turnout hidden behind a massive billboard advertising a personal injury attorney's services. The irony of that billboard, promising justice for the wrongfully harmed, was entirely lost on Harlan. He had been a fixture of the Western Hills Police Department for many years, and in that time he had developed what he considered to be an infallible instinct for spotting criminals. That instinct, of course, had nothing to do with actual criminal behavior and everything to do with the color of a person's skin. Harlan was middle-aged, with the thick neck and broad shoulders of a man who had once been athletic but had let himself go soft around the middle. He kept his hair in a military-style buzz cut, a remnant from his time in the army that he referenced constantly despite having never seen combat. His face had a permanently flushed quality, the capillaries in his cheeks broken from years of drinking too much after shifts, and his eyes were small and mean, constantly scanning for something to pounce on. The rain drummed against the roof of the cruiser in a relentless rhythm. Harlan sipped from a large gas station coffee that had gone cold long ago. His free hand drummed against the steering wheel in time with his impatience. Western Hills was an affluent suburb, the kind of place where houses started at millions and went up from there. A community of old money and new tech wealth, manicured lawns and private security systems, people who expected the police to keep a certain element out. Harlan had appointed himself the gatekeeper. In the passenger seat sat Parker Webb, a young rookie who had been on the force for several months. Webb was everything Harlan was not. Idealistic, genuinely committed to the motto painted on the side of their cruiser, to protect and serve. He had joined the police force because he believed in community, in the idea that officers could be a force for good in people's lives. He hadn't yet learned that for cops like Harlan, the motto was just a suggestion, words painted on metal that meant nothing when the cameras weren't rolling. Webb shifted uncomfortably in his seat, watching the rain streak down the windshield. He had been paired with Harlan for his field training, and in the past several months he had witnessed things that kept him awake at night. Stops that had no justification, searches conducted on fabricated pretenses, the casual cruelty of a man who had been given power and used it like a weapon against those too vulnerable to fight back. Webb knew he should say something. He knew he should report what he had seen. But the thin blue line wasn't just a slogan. It was a threat. Officers who broke ranks found their careers destroyed, their lives made miserable in ways both subtle and overt. Webb had a mother at home who was proud of him, who had cried at his academy graduation. He couldn't bear to disappoint her, so he stayed silent, and the silence ate at him. "Dead night," Harlan muttered, his voice thick with boredom. "Nothing moving out there." Webb nodded, saying nothing. He had learned that with Harlan, it was better to speak as little as possible. Every word was an opportunity for the senior officer to find fault, to mock, to assert dominance. The windshield wipers swept back and forth in their hypnotic rhythm. The road ahead was empty, slick with rain, the streetlights casting orange pools of illumination that waved and danced in the downpour. And then headlights appeared in the distance. Harlan straightened in his seat, his small eyes narrowing as he watched the approaching vehicle. It moved smoothly, confidently, its headlights cutting through the rain like the eyes of some predatory animal. As it drew closer, Harlan felt his pulse quicken. It was a Mercedes-Benz S-Class, the newest model, finished in a slate gray that gleamed even in the darkness. The car probably cost more than Harlan made in several years. It moved at exactly the speed limit, maintaining perfect distance from the center line, its turn signals activating precisely when required. A perfect driver, which meant nothing to Harlan. "Run the plates on that Benz," he ordered, his voice dropping to the hungry growl that Webb had come to recognize all too well. Webb typed the plate number into the mobile data terminal mounted on the dashboard. The system hummed for a moment, searching through databases, and then returned its results. "It's registered to a Desmond Whitmore," Webb reported, keeping his voice carefully neutral. "Address is up on Highland Crest." Highland Crest, the most exclusive gated community in Western Hills, the kind of place where hedge fund managers and tech executives built their compounds behind walls of stone and iron, the kind of place where a car like that Mercedes wouldn't raise a single eyebrow. Harlan leaned forward, squinting through the windshield wipers. The Mercedes passed through the pool of light from a street lamp, and for just a moment the interior was illuminated. The driver was visible in profile, a black man wearing what appeared to be a suit. That was all Harlan needed to see. "You're right," he scoffed, a cruel smirk twisting his lips. "A guy looking like that driving a car like this in Highland Crest at this hour? He either stole it or he's dealing, one or the other. No other explanation." Webb felt his stomach clench. "The plates came back clean, Vance. No warrants, no flags, no stolen vehicle report, and he hasn't committed any traffic violations." "He crossed the double yellow line back there," Harlan interrupted, his hand already reaching for the switch that would activate the lights and sirens. Webb blinked. "I didn't see him cross any line." Harlan turned to look at him, and there was something cold and dangerous in those small eyes. "Then you need to get your eyes checked, rookie, because I saw it clear as day." Before Webb could respond, Harlan hit the switch. The red and blue lights exploded to life, their strobing colors violent against the rain-slicked street, painting the darkness in alternating shades of emergency and authority. The Mercedes immediately activated its right turn signal, a gesture of compliance, of respect for the law, and began to pull smoothly toward the shoulder. Harlan grinned. "Got you." Webb said nothing, but deep in his gut, in the place where his idealism still clung to life by its fingernails, he knew that whatever was about to happen would be wrong. He just didn't know how wrong. Inside the Mercedes-Benz, Judge Desmond Whitmore let out a long, slow breath. He had seen the lights in his rearview mirror, watched them flare to life with that familiar, violent beauty, and felt something heavy settle in his chest. It was not fear, not exactly. It was something more complicated than that. It was exhaustion, resignation, the bone-deep weariness of a man who had spent decades navigating a world that constantly questioned his right to exist in the spaces he had earned. Whitmore had been driving, returning home from a day that had stretched far beyond its intended boundaries. He had spent long hours in his chambers, reviewing briefs and hearing arguments and making decisions that would affect people's lives in ways both profound and mundane. His eyes burned with fatigue, his lower back ached from sitting in his leather chair, his tie had been loosened hours ago, the knot pulled down to mid-chest, the top button of his shirt undone in a rare concession to physical comfort. He was minutes from his bed, minutes from pulling into the driveway of the house he had worked decades to afford, minutes from the quiet darkness of his master bedroom and the Egyptian cotton sheets that awaited him. But first this, always, eventually this. Whitmore pulled the Mercedes onto the shoulder with practiced smoothness. He knew exactly what to do. He had known the drill his entire life, had been taught it by his mother when he was barely old enough to drive, had practiced it in front of mirrors and in his mind until it was second nature. He activated the interior dome lights so the officers could see clearly inside the vehicle. He placed both hands at the 10 and 2 position on the steering wheel, fingers spread, palms visible. He kept his movements slow and deliberate, announcing nothing, threatening nothing. He became in that moment exactly what America required him to be: non-threatening, compliant, safe. The rain continued to hammer against the roof of the car, a relentless percussion that seemed to mock the absurdity of the situation. Whitmore watched in his side mirror as the patrol car door opened and a figure emerged, a large man moving with the swagger of someone who believed the world belonged to him. Whitmore sighed again. He had been born on the south side of Chicago. His mother, Loretta, had worked multiple jobs to keep food on the table, cleaning houses in the wealthy North Shore suburbs during the day, taking in laundry in the evenings, working as a hotel maid on weekends when she could get the shifts. His father had been a concept more than a person, a man who had vanished before Desmond was old enough to form memories, leaving behind nothing but a last name and a genetic contribution. Loretta Whitmore had raised her son alone, and she had raised him with a purpose. She had scraped together enough money to send him to a Catholic school where the teachers actually cared, where the expectations were high, where a black boy from the South Side could dream of something beyond the limited horizons that America had assigned to him. She had drilled into him the importance of education, of discipline, of carrying himself with a dignity that could not be questioned or dismissed. "They will try to break you," she had told him once when he was a boy. "They will try to make you small. They will tell you in 1,000 ways that you don't belong." She had looked him in the eyes. "And when they do, you will stand tall, you will speak clearly, you will let your work speak for itself." Her voice had been firm. "And you will never, ever give them the satisfaction of seeing you fall." Whitmore had listened. He had excelled in school, graduated valedictorian of his high school class, won a full scholarship to a prestigious university. From there, he had gone to law school, where he had graduated near the top of his class despite working part-time jobs to send money home to his mother. He had clerked for a federal judge, worked as a federal prosecutor for many years, built a reputation as a brilliant and fair legal mind, and then he had received the phone call that changed his life. The President of the United States wanted to nominate him for a federal judgeship. Desmond Whitmore had stood in his modest apartment in Chicago, the phone pressed to his ear, and felt tears streaming down his face. He had called his mother immediately afterward, and she had cried too, cried for the little boy she had raised alone, for the man he had become, for the dream that had been achieved against all odds. Loretta Whitmore had lived long enough to see her son take the oath of office, to watch him ascend to the federal bench, to know that her sacrifices had not been in vain. Whitmore thought of her now as he sat in his expensive car on the side of the road, hands on the wheel, waiting for an officer who had already decided he was guilty of something. He thought of her strength, her dignity, her refusal to let the world break her. He would need that strength now. The officer was approaching, his silhouette distorted by the rain streaming down the side window. Whitmore could already tell from the aggressive stride, from the hand resting on the weapon at his hip, that this was not going to be a routine interaction. This was going to be something else entirely. Whitmore had a choice to make. He could announce his position immediately. He could inform this officer in no uncertain terms that he was addressing a sitting federal judge, that any further escalation would be the mistake of a lifetime. He could invoke the power of his position like a shield, like a force field that would repel the aggression he could already feel radiating from the approaching figure. But something stopped him. A thought occurred to him. A cold, hard thought that cut through his exhaustion and settled in his mind with uncomfortable clarity. If this officer was willing to pull over a black man driving a Mercedes in an affluent neighborhood with no traffic violation, no probable cause, nothing but the color of the driver's skin to justify the stop, what was he doing to the people who couldn't fight back? What was he doing to the teenagers in the poorer neighborhoods, to the single mothers just trying to get home from late shifts, to the elderly men who didn't have advanced degrees and federal badges to protect them? Whitmore had spent his career in the law. He understood the power of evidence. He understood that the most damning thing you could do to expose wrongdoing was to let the wrongdoer damn himself. He made his decision. He would not reveal his identity. He would comply completely, fully, without resistance. He would let this officer do exactly what he intended to do, document every moment with his impeccable memory, and then he would bring the full weight of the federal government down on this department like the wrath of God. A knock on the window, sharp, aggressive, the barrel of a maglite flashlight rapping against the glass with an authority that assumed compliance. Whitmore rolled the window down halfway. Let the documentation begin. Officer Vance Harlan had not always been a predator. There had been a time, long ago, when he had joined the police force with something resembling idealism. He had been fresh from a stint in the army that had left him with a sense of purpose but no direction. The police academy had seemed like a natural transition, structure, discipline, a mission to protect and serve, but the years had changed him. His personnel file, if anyone had cared to examine it closely, told a story that the department preferred to ignore. Formal complaints of excessive force over many years, incidents that had been quietly resolved with settlements and non-disclosure agreements, the paperwork buried so deep that only the most determined investigator would ever find it. Pattern after pattern of behavior that should have ended his career many times over. And yet here he was, still wearing the badge, still carrying the gun, still prowling the streets of Western Hills like a wolf among sheep. The Union had protected him. That was the simple explanation, and it was true as far as it went. The president of the local police union had a philosophy that he expressed to every new member. We protect our own no matter what. The public doesn't understand the pressures we face, the split-second decisions we have to make. When they come for one of us, they come for all of us. Under this philosophy, complaints were contested, evidence was questioned, victims were discredited, and officers like Harlan were allowed to continue their careers unimpeded, their misconduct buried under mountains of legal technicalities and procedural objections. But the Union protection only explained how Harlan had survived. It didn't explain how he had become what he was. That transformation had happened gradually, so slowly that Harlan himself hadn't noticed it. He had started his career believing in the mission, but somewhere along the way the mission had gotten lost. The citizens he was supposed to protect had become obstacles. The laws he was supposed to enforce had become suggestions. The badge on his chest had transformed from a symbol of public service into something else entirely, a crown. That was how Harlan thought of it now. He was the king of his domain, the arbiter of justice in his territory, answerable to no one except the vague and easily manipulated oversight of his department. The people who lived in his patrol area existed at his discretion. They drove on his streets, walked on his sidewalks, breathed his air, and if he decided they didn't belong, if his gut told him they were criminals, regardless of what the evidence said, then he had the authority to remove them. He had developed his own code, his own language that the other dirty cops in the department understood. Code 8 was the magic phrase, a claim that he smelled marijuana emanating from a vehicle, an unprovable assertion that granted instant probable cause to search, to detain, to escalate. It didn't matter if the vehicle actually contained marijuana. It didn't matter if the driver had never touched drugs in their life. Once the words were spoken, they became their own justification, a key that unlocked the door to whatever Harlan wanted to do, and what Harlan wanted to do, more often than not, was assert his dominance. He kept what he called drop bags in his patrol vehicle, small plastic baggies containing residue of controlled substances, planted evidence to be discovered during searches that otherwise came up clean. He had never had to use them against anyone with the resources to fight back. His victims were always the same. poor, minority, defenseless, people the system was designed to fail. Captain Bennett Morrison, the commanding officer of the Western Hills Police Department, had suspected for years that something was wrong with Harlan. He had reviewed the complaint patterns, noticed the disparities in who Harlan stopped and how those stops escalated. But every time Morrison had tried to build a case, the union had intervened, witnesses recanted, evidence disappeared, technicalities multiplied, the system protected its own. Morrison had tried to warn Harlan once in a private meeting behind closed doors. "You're playing a dangerous game," he had said. "Sooner or later you're going to pull over the wrong person, someone with resources, someone who can fight back, and when that happens there won't be anything I can do to help you." Harlan had laughed. "Captain, I've been doing this job for many years. I know who belongs in this neighborhood and who doesn't. I've never been wrong yet." Now, walking through the rain toward the Mercedes, Harlan felt the familiar surge of power that accompanied every stop. His hand rested comfortably on his weapon. His eyes were fixed on the silhouette behind the wheel. His mind had already made its judgment. This man was a criminal. Harlan didn't need evidence to know this. He didn't need probable cause or reasonable suspicion or any of the legal frameworks that were supposed to constrain his authority. He had his instincts, and his instincts had told him everything he needed to know in the split second that the Mercedes had passed through the streetlights. A black man, an expensive car, Highland Crest, late at night. The math didn't add up, therefore criminal. Harlan reached the driver's side window and rapped sharply on the glass with his mag light. The window rolled down halfway. He shone the flashlight directly into the driver's face, deliberately blinding, deliberately aggressive. The man behind the wheel didn't flinch. Harlan noted this immediately. Most people, when confronted with an aggressive officer, showed some sign of fear, a tremor in the hands, a quickening of breath, a deferential shift in posture. But this man sat completely still, his hands visible on the steering wheel, his expression calm and composed. That calm infuriated Harlan more than defiance would have. "License, registration, and proof of insurance," Harlan barked, not bothering with a greeting or an explanation for the stop. He wanted to establish dominance immediately, to let this man know who was in control. "Good evening, officer," the man said. His voice was deep and resonant, the kind of voice that filled the room without trying. It was a voice used to commanding attention, used to being heard, and it was entirely devoid of fear. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" Harlan felt his jaw tighten. The question itself was innocent enough, but the way it was asked, calm, measured, confident, challenged his authority in a way he couldn't quite articulate. "I don't answer questions, pal," Harlan sneered. "I ask them. Now hand over the papers before I decide to make this difficult for you." The man nodded once, slowly. "I'm reaching into my breast pocket to retrieve my wallet." He announced his movements, deliberate and visible. He pulled out a leather wallet, extracted his driver's license, then reached toward the glove compartment, again announcing his movements, and produced the vehicle registration. He handed both through the window. Harlan snatched them from his hand and examined them in the beam of his flashlight. The driver's license confirmed what the computer had already told him. Desmond Whitmore, address on Highland Crest. "Desmond Whitmore," Harlan read aloud, making the name sound like an accusation. "This your car, Desmond?" "The registration you are holding indicates that it is," the man replied. His voice remained perfectly level. Harlan hated that voice. He hated the educated diction, the precise enunciation, the complete absence of deference. This man spoke like someone used to being respected, and that simply wouldn't do. "Where are you coming from?" Harlan demanded, leaning closer to the window. "Work." "Work?" Harlan let out a harsh laugh, making sure his contempt was audible. "What kind of work lets you afford a car like this? You moving weight?" For the first time, something changed in the man's expression, a slight tightening of the jaw. But when he spoke, his voice remained measured. "I am an attorney, officer, and unless you have a reasonable, articulable suspicion that I've committed a crime, I would like my license back so I can go home." Attorney. The word usually made cops pause, gave them reason to reconsider their approach. An attorney meant legal knowledge, meant potential complaints filed with proper terminology, meant trouble. But to Harlan it was just another challenge, another man who thought his credentials made him untouchable. Harlan was about to teach him otherwise. "Step out of the car," Harlan ordered. "On what grounds?" the man asked. "Because I smell marijuana coming from the vehicle." It was the lie, the magic words, the key that unlocked everything. The man's eyes met Harlan's directly, and something in that gaze made Harlan uncomfortable. There was no fear there, no panic, just a calm, assessing intelligence that seemed to be recording everything. "That is factually impossible," the man said. "I do not smoke marijuana. No one has ever smoked marijuana in this vehicle, and I suspect you know that." Harlan felt his face flush with anger. No one talked back to him. No one called him a liar, even by implication. "Step out of the car now," Harlan yelled, his hand dropping to the butt of his service weapon, "or I will drag you out." Behind him, barely visible through the rain, his rookie partner Parker Webb was watching, and across the street, invisible in the darkness, a porch light flickered on. The rain continued its assault on the night, and Vance Harlan felt himself entering that familiar space, that place where his authority was absolute, where the law was whatever he decided it was, where the man before him existed only at his sufferance. Webb stood by the passenger side of the Mercedes, his hand resting on his belt. He had watched Harlan operate enough times to know what was coming. The aggressive posture, the fabricated probable cause, the escalation that always seemed to spin out of control. This time felt different, though. This time there was something in the detained man's eyes that made Webb deeply uneasy. It wasn't the usual fear or anger or desperate bravado that he had come to expect. It was something colder than that, something that looked almost like patience, like the man was waiting for something. Harlan shone his flashlight directly into Whitmore's eyes again, a deliberate act of discomfort that he had perfected over years of practice. I said step out of the car. Don't make me ask you again. You have not asked me, Whitmore replied calmly. You have ordered me. There is a difference, but I will comply. He reached slowly toward the door handle, announcing his movements as he had done throughout the encounter. I am now opening the door. I'm stepping out of the vehicle. My hands will remain visible at all times. Whitmore stepped from the Mercedes. Harlan immediately noted his height. The man was tall, at least 6'2", and he carried himself with an upright posture that seemed almost regal. His suit, despite the late hour, still looked expensive, charcoal gray, perfectly tailored. The tie was loosened, but even that small concession to comfort looked deliberate rather than sloppy. This was a man who knew exactly who he was. Harlan hated him for it. Hands on the vehicle, Harlan commanded. Feet apart, don't move. Whitmore complied, placing his palms flat against the rain-slicked surface of his Mercedes. Water ran down his suit jacket, soaking the expensive fabric. He said nothing. Harlan stepped closer, his presence designed to intimidate. You got a smart mouth, you know that? All you had to do was cooperate, show a little respect for the badge. I have shown you nothing but cooperation, officer, Whitmore replied. I have complied with every instruction. I have announced every movement. I have not raised my voice or made any threatening gestures. If you are perceiving disrespect, I suggest you examine the source of that perception. The words were delivered without heat, without emotion, and that made them somehow more infuriating. Harlan leaned in close enough that Whitmore could smell the stale coffee on his breath. You think you're smarter than me? You think that fancy car and that fancy suit make you better than me? I think, Whitmore said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, that you should consider your next actions very carefully. He paused. I'm warning you, officer, as someone with considerable experience in these matters, that what happens after this moment cannot be undone. Not by your union, not by your captain, not by anyone in this state. For just a moment, something flickered in Harlan's eyes, a shadow of doubt, a whisper of warning. But the moment passed. The doubt was drowned out by the rage that was Harlan's constant companion, by the absolute certainty that he was untouchable. Is that a threat? Harlan growled. Are you threatening an officer of the law? Whitmore turned his head slightly, just enough to make eye contact. I'm offering you an exit, officer. I'm giving you the opportunity to return my documents, get back in your vehicle, and drive away. I will forget this encounter ever happened. No complaints, no reports, nothing. He paused. But if you choose to continue down this path, I promise you, when this is over, there will be no exit, and the consequences will follow you for the rest of your life. Harlan stared at him. The rain hammered down. The moment stretched, and then Harlan made his choice. He grabbed Whitmore by the lapels of his expensive suit. The physical contact was instantaneous and violent. One moment Whitmore was standing calmly with his hands on the vehicle. The next, Harlan had fisted the fabric of his jacket and was spinning him around with the full force of his considerable weight. Whitmore's body slammed against the side of the Mercedes with a sound that echoed through the rain, a dull, meaty thud that made Webb wince from 20 feet away. Vance, take it easy, Webb shouted, stepping forward around the front of the vehicle. His voice cracked with panic. He's cooperating. There's no need for— Shut up and watch the perimeter, Harlan roared, not turning to look at his partner. His face was flushed, veins standing out on his thick neck. This doesn't concern you. Webb stopped, frozen by the command in that voice. He had seen Harlan like this before, lost in the adrenaline, operating on pure instinct and aggression. Trying to intervene now would only make things worse, would only escalate the situation further, or so he told himself. The truth, the shameful truth that Webb would have to confront later, was simpler than that. He was afraid of Harlan, afraid of what would happen to his career if he crossed the senior officer, afraid of the repercussions that came to cops who broke ranks. So he stood there and he watched. Harlan kicked Whitmore's legs apart roughly, forcing him into an off-balance stance against the car. Put your hands behind your back now. I advise you, Whitmore said, his cheek pressed against the cold metal of the Mercedes, that you are executing an unlawful arrest. His voice remained remarkably calm. I've committed no crime. I've given you no reasonable suspicion of any crime. This stop, this search is illegal, and whatever you are about to do is illegal. That preternatural composure seemed to enrage Harlan even further. You think you can lawyer your way out of this? Harlan grabbed Whitmore's wrists, yanking his arms behind his back with excessive force. The movement sent a jolt of pain through Whitmore's shoulders, but he refused to cry out. You're under arrest for resisting arrest and obstruction of a law enforcement officer. I have not resisted, Whitmore stated clearly, projecting his voice so that it would carry to anyone who might be listening. I have complied fully with every instruction. I am not obstructing anything. For the record, I am standing calmly while being subjected to excessive force for no lawful reason. Heavy steel handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. Harlan tightened them deliberately, ratcheting them down until they bit into the skin. Whitmore felt the metal edges cutting into his flesh, but still refused to show any reaction. He had dealt with bullies before, in school, in his career, on the bench. They all operated the same way. They fed on fear, on submission, on the satisfaction of breaking their victims. The only power you had over them was the power of refusal, the refusal to be broken, the refusal to give them what they wanted. Harlan wasn't getting anything from him tonight. Across the street, invisible in the darkness of a second-floor apartment, Kayla Williams had been awakened by the strobe of police lights reflecting off her bedroom wall. She had stumbled to the window, irritated, expecting to see a routine traffic stop that would be over in minutes. What she saw instead made her blood run cold. An older black man in a suit being slammed against the car, an officer, large, aggressive, clearly out of control, screaming accusations that made no sense. Another officer standing by, doing nothing. Kayla's hand found her phone before she even made the conscious decision to record. The camera app opened. The red recording light appeared, and she began to document everything. Back at the Mercedes, Harlan was not finished. "Now we're going to search this vehicle," he announced, his voice loud enough for Webb to hear. "And when I find the drugs I know you're carrying, this is going to go from bad to worse for you." "There are no drugs in this vehicle," Whitmore said. "There have never been drugs in this vehicle, but you already know that. This search is a pretext, and we both understand it." Harlan ignored him. He walked to the driver's door, which stood open, and began his search. What followed was not an investigation, it was a violation. Harlan tore through the Mercedes with barely contained fury. He pulled documents from the center console and threw them onto the wet pavement. He ripped the lining of the trunk, searching for hidden compartments that didn't exist. He dumped the contents of Whitmore's briefcase into a puddle, legal briefs and a leather-bound calendar, all soaking through in the rain. The search went on and on, Harlan becoming more aggressive as each compartment came up empty. Nothing. No drugs, no weapons, no contraband of any kind. Nothing but the possessions of a successful attorney, now scattered across the roadside like garbage. Webb, watching from the perimeter he had been assigned to hold, quietly gathered some of the papers that were floating away in the runoff. He glanced at them briefly. Legal correspondence, court documents, something with an official-looking letterhead, but he was too focused on his partner to really process what he was seeing. Harlan emerged from the Mercedes empty-handed, his fury now at a boiling point. He had been so certain, so absolutely convinced that this man was dirty, and he had found nothing. But Vance Harlan was not the kind of man who admitted mistakes. "Where is it?" he demanded, stomping back to where Whitmore stood, cuffed against the car. "Where did you hide it? Did you swallow it? Is it up inside you somewhere?" "There is nothing to hide," Whitmore replied. "I'm exactly what I appear to be, a law-abiding citizen who is driving home from work. The only crime being committed here tonight is yours." Harlan's face contorted. The accusation, delivered with that same maddening calm, pushed him over an edge he had been teetering on all night. "We'll see about that," he snarled. "We'll see what you're hiding when we get you to the hospital for an examination. We'll see how smug you are when they put you in a gown and start." "Vance," Webb's voice cut through the rain. There was something different in his tone now, something approaching actual authority. Harlan spun around. "What?" "People are watching." Harlan looked. Across the street a porch light had come on. An elderly man in a bathrobe stood on his steps squinting through the rain. Next to him, barely visible in the doorway, a woman was holding what looked like a phone, and further down the block a car had pulled to the side of the road, a ride-share vehicle from the looks of it. The driver was standing outside, his own phone raised and recording. For the first time that night, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Harlan's face, but only for a moment. "Let them watch," he growled. "They're witnessing law enforcement in action, nothing more." He turned back to Whitmore and made his decision. "You're under arrest for resisting arrest and obstruction of justice. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As Harlan read the Miranda warning, a formality he had never truly respected, a third witness was settling into position. The rideshare driver, a man named Victor Okonkwo, had stopped his vehicle when he saw what looked like a rough arrest in progress. He had no personal stake in this situation. He didn't know the man being arrested or the officers conducting the arrest, but Victor had grown up in a country where police brutality was common and accountability was rare. He had come to America believing in the promise of justice, of fairness, of a system that protected the rights of individuals against the power of the state. What he was witnessing looked nothing like that promise, so he recorded, and he would keep recording until the very end. The Mercedes was towed away. Whitmore watched it go, his face impassive, his wrists still bound behind his back in handcuffs that were cutting off his circulation. The car represented more than just expensive machinery to him. It represented decades of work, decades of sacrifice, decades of proving over and over again that a black man from the south side of Chicago could achieve anything, could earn anything, could belong anywhere. And now it was being dragged away on a flatbed like evidence of a crime that had never been committed. Harlan approached him, a triumphant smirk on his rain-soaked face. "Time to take a ride, counselor? Let's see how that fancy law degree helps you in a holding cell." He grabbed Whitmore by the arm, his grip unnecessarily rough, and began to march him toward the waiting patrol car. Whitmore spoke quietly, his voice pitched so that only Harlan would hear. Officer Harlan, I'm going to say this one more time because I genuinely believe you have not understood the magnitude of the mistake you are making. Harlan snorted. Save it for your arraignment. I'm not an ordinary citizen, Whitmore continued, his voice steady. I am not someone who can be bullied or intimidated or swept under the rug. He paused. When this is over, and it will be over soon, I'm going to dismantle everything you have built, every shortcut you have taken, every lie you have told, every victim you have created. His voice dropped even lower. I'm going to bring it all into the light, and there will be nowhere for you to hide. Harlan stopped walking. He turned to face Whitmore directly, their faces inches apart. You know what I hear? Harlan said, his voice dripping with contempt. I hear a scared man making threats he can't back up. I hear a criminal trying to talk his way out of consequences. I've heard it 100 times before. It never works. Perhaps, Whitmore said, or perhaps this is the first time you have encountered someone with the resources to hold you accountable. He met Harlan's eyes. We shall see. Harlan's eyes narrowed. There was something in Whitmore's voice, a certainty, a confidence that penetrated even his arrogance, but he shook it off. He always shook it off. Get in the car, Harlan ordered. Pushing Whitmore toward the back door of the patrol vehicle, the door opened. Whitmore was shoved inside, his head pushed down roughly in the standard technique for loading handcuffed suspects. His shoulder scraped against the door frame, sending a jolt of pain through his already aching arms. The door slammed shut with a metallic finality. Inside the cage of the patrol car, Whitmore sat in silence. The rain streaked down the windows, blurring the lights outside into abstract smears of color. He could hear Harlan and Webb talking outside, their voices muffled but their body language clear. Harlan aggressive and animated, Webb defensive and uncomfortable. Whitmore closed his eyes. He thought about his mother, about her strength, about the way she had refused to be broken by a world that seemed designed to grind people like her into dust. He thought about the cases he had presided over, the civil rights violations, the excessive force complaints, the pattern and practice investigations that had exposed entire departments riddled with corruption and abuse. He thought about what was about to happen. When Harlan climbed into the driver's seat and Webb slid into the passenger side, Whitmore opened his eyes. You have made your choice, he said quietly. Harlan met his eyes in the rearview mirror. Yeah, I have. And by the time we're done with you, you're going to wish you just kept your mouth shut and showed some respect. The engine started, the patrol car pulled away from the curb, and through the rear window Whitmore watched the scene recede. The gathering witnesses, the floating documents, the spot on the road where his life had just been irrevocably changed, but not in the way Harlan expected. Whitmore was a federal judge. He had been appointed to the bench by the President of the United States and confirmed by the Senate. He had spent many years adjudicating the most serious cases in the American legal system. He had the power to sign search warrants that could bring down criminal enterprises, to issue injunctions that could halt corporate malfeasance, to hold anyone, including law enforcement officers, in contempt of court. And now, thanks to Officer Vance Harlan, he had personal, first-hand experience of exactly the kind of abuse that his court was designed to address. The patrol car moved through the rain-soaked streets of Western Hills, carrying its occupants toward consequences that none of them could yet fully imagine. But they were coming. They were definitely coming. The Western Hills Police Department was a low-slung brick building that looked like it had been designed decades ago and never updated since. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a sickly greenish pallor. The walls were the color of institutional despair, beige that had yellowed with decades of neglect. Late that night, Vance Harlan marched Desmond Whitmore through the front entrance with the swagger of a man who had just made the arrest of his career. The officers on duty glanced up from their paperwork. A few nodded at Harlan. Others returned to their tasks without acknowledgement. It was a quiet night. A DUI sleeping it off and holding, a domestic dispute that had been resolved peacefully, nothing that required much attention. The booking desk was manned by Sergeant Gloria Patterson, a longtime veteran with steel-gray hair and the kind of seen-it-all expression that came from decades of processing humanity's worst decisions. What do we have here? Patterson asked, pulling up the booking software on her computer. Resisting arrest and obstruction, Harlan announced proudly. Pulled him over in Highland Crest high-end Mercedes. He got lippy, refused to cooperate, and I had to subdue him. Patterson looked at the man in handcuffs. She noted the tailored suit, now soaked and disheveled, the dignified bearing despite the circumstances, the complete absence of the usual booking behaviors. No slurred words, no belligerence, no obvious signs of intoxication. Something didn't add up. Name? She asked. Desmond Whitmore, Whitmore replied. His voice was calm, his diction clear. Patterson typed the name into the system. Address? Highland Crest Drive, Highland Crest, the most exclusive community in Western Hills. Patterson's fingers hesitated over the keyboard. Occupation? She asked, her eyes more alert now. I am an attorney. Behind him, Harlan snorted. Sure you are. An attorney driving around at this hour in a car that costs more than most people's houses. An attorney who can't follow simple instructions from a police officer. Patterson ignored him. There was something about this man, something in the way he carried himself, something in the quiet patience of his gaze, that triggered warning bells in her mind. She entered the name into the federal database. The search took only seconds. When the results populated, Patterson felt the blood drain from her face. A flag, red and urgent, the kind of flag she had never seen before in her many years of booking arrests. She stared at the screen, read the words twice to make sure she understood them, then read them a third time, because surely there had to be some mistake. There was no mistake. "I need to make a phone call," she said, standing abruptly from her desk. Harlan frowned. "What? Why? I've got the paperwork right here." "Stay here," Patterson interrupted. "Don't process him. Don't fingerprint him. Don't do anything." She walked quickly toward Captain Morrison's office, her sensible shoes clicking against the linoleum with increasing urgency. Harlan watched her go, confusion and annoyance warring on his face. What the hell is her problem? Whitmore said nothing, but for the first time that night the ghost of a smile flickered at the corner of his mouth. It was beginning. Captain Bennett Morrison was not supposed to be at the precinct at that hour. He was supposed to be at home, asleep in his bed, dreaming whatever dreams a police captain dreamed. But Sergeant Patterson's phone call had yanked him out of that sleep with a message that made no sense. "You need to come in now. Don't ask questions, just come." Morrison had been a cop for many years. He had learned to trust his instincts and the instincts of his officers. Patterson was not an alarmist. If she said he needed to come in, he needed to come in. He arrived at the precinct, his shirt untucked, his badge clipped hastily to his belt. Patterson met him at the door to his office, her face the color of old concrete. "Tell me," Morrison said. Patterson led him inside, closed the door, and pulled up the booking database on his computer. "Harlan made an arrest tonight. Traffic stop in Highland Crest. Claims the subject was resisting and obstructing." Morrison rubbed his eyes. "And?" "I ran the name through the federal database." She turned the monitor so Morrison could see the screen. For a long moment, Morrison simply stared. His brain refused to process what his eyes were telling him. The words on the screen seemed to rearrange themselves, to morph into something that couldn't possibly be real. Then the reality hit him. He sat down heavily in his chair. "That's not possible," he breathed. "That's not... Harlan didn't..." "He did." Patterson's voice was barely above a whisper. "Vance Harlan arrested a sitting federal judge." Morrison closed his eyes. In his mind's eye he saw his career, many years of service, of dedication, of working his way up through the ranks, crumbling into ash. He saw the lawsuits, the investigations, the newspaper headlines, the congressional hearings. He saw everything falling apart. "Where is he now?" Morrison asked. "The judge, where is he?" "Still in processing. I told Harlan not to do anything until you got here." "Good, that's good." Morrison stood, his legs unsteady beneath him. "Get Chief Harrison on the phone. I don't care what time it is." He paused. "And Patterson, not a word of this to anyone. Patterson nodded and hurried out. Morrison stood alone in his office, staring at the name on the screen. Judge Desmond Whitmore, United States District Court, Northern District of Illinois, status active. Vance Harlan had just handcuffed a man with the power to send FBI agents after anyone who violated civil rights. A man who had spent many years presiding over the most serious federal cases in one of the largest judicial districts in the country. A man who had connections reaching all the way to the Department of Justice in Washington, and Harlan had slammed him against his own car, cuffed him, searched his vehicle without cause, and arrested him on fabricated charges. Morrison reached for the phone. It was going to be a very long night. Far away in the FBI's Chicago field office, a computer terminal chimed with an incoming alert. The field office never truly slept. Even late at night, agents moved through the corridors, analysts reviewed data, and the machinery of federal law enforcement hummed along regardless of the hour. The war on crime did not keep business hours. Duty agent Sophia Torres was reviewing reports from an ongoing narcotics investigation when the alert flashed across her screen. She frowned, clicked on the notification. Judicial Protection Alert, Priority 1. Subject, Whitmore Desmond J. Status, Active Federal Judicial Officer. Alert type, Entry into Local Law Enforcement Custody System. Jurisdiction, Western Hills Police Department, Illinois. Torres read the alert twice, then picked up her phone. "This is Torres. I need SAC Lynch on the line." "Yes, I know what time it is. Wake him up." Special Agent in Charge Marcus Lynch received the phone call. By shortly afterward, he was on his way to the field office. Soon he was standing in the operations center, surrounded by the senior members of his team, reading the same alert that Torres had flagged. "I know Whitmore," Lynch said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "We've worked cases together. He signed warrants for my anti-corruption task force. This man is not a criminal. He's one of the most respected jurists in the Northern District." "What are we looking at here, boss?" asked Agent Elena Miller, a veteran who specialized in civil rights investigations. Lynch pulled up the available information on his tablet. "Traffic stop in Western Hills, a suburb about an hour west of the city. Officer claims the subject was resisting arrest and obstructing. Subject was booked late tonight." "On what charges?" "Resisting arrest and obstruction of justice." Miller let out a low whistle. "That's a catch-all. No underlying offense?" "None listed." The implications hung in the air. Resisting arrest and obstruction without any underlying crime usually meant one thing: a cop who had escalated a situation beyond all reason and needed something, anything, to justify the arrest after the fact. "Get me everything on the arresting officer," Lynch ordered. Personnel files, complaint history, prior incidents. I want to know what kind of cop we're dealing with. He turned to the room. And start mobilizing a team. We're wheels up soon. If this is what it looks like, we're going to need to secure evidence before anyone has a chance to bury it. The FBI field office exploded into activity. In the holding cell of the Western Hills Police Department, Judge Desmond Whitmore sat on a metal bench and waited. The cell was small, concrete walls painted the same institutional beige as the rest of the building. A toilet set in the corner, unscreened. A single fluorescent light buzzed overhead. The smell was a mixture of industrial cleaner and human desperation. Whitmore had presided over trials that sent men to places far worse than this. He had sentenced drug kingpins to federal penitentiaries, ordered white-collar criminals to forfeit their fortunes, watched defendants weep as they were led away in chains to spend decades behind bars. He had always believed in the necessity of these punishments. Justice required consequences. Society required protection from those who would harm it. But sitting here in this small cell, wearing a suit that was still damp from the rain, his wrists raw from too tight handcuffs, Whitmore felt something he had never felt from the bench. He felt what it was like to be on the other side, the humiliation, the powerlessness, the absolute control that the state could exercise over an individual's body and freedom. And he understood, perhaps for the first time, why so many of the defendants who came before him carried that particular look in their eyes, the look of people who had been ground down by a system that was supposed to protect them. The difference, of course, was that Whitmore was innocent. The charges against him were fabricated, the arrest unlawful, the entire encounter a violation of his constitutional rights. But how many others sitting in cells like this one were also innocent? How many had been swept up by officers like Harlan, processed through a system that was supposed to demand proof but too often settled for accusations? Whitmore made a decision. When this was over, when the inevitable consequences had finished unfolding, he was not simply going to return to his courtroom and his comfortable life. He was going to use every ounce of his judicial authority to ensure that what had happened to him could never happen to anyone else. Vance Harlan had wanted to break him. Instead, Harlan had radicalized him. A knock on the cell's door interrupted his thoughts. The viewing slot slid open and a pair of eyes appeared, eyes he didn't recognize. Judge Whitmore? Whitmore stood, approaching the door. Yes? I'm Captain Morrison. I'm the commanding officer of this precinct. The man paused, seemingly unable to find the words. I need you to know that I'm aware of who you are, and I am deeply, profoundly sorry for what has happened here tonight. Are you releasing me, Captain? A longer pause. The FBI is on their way. They've asked that we maintain the status quo until they arrive. It's a matter of evidence preservation, chain of custody. I'm told that your release will be handled by federal authorities. Whitmore nodded slowly. I see. And Officer Harlan? He's been suspended pending investigation. Not arrested? Morrison's silence was answer enough. Whitmore stepped closer to the door, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Captain Morrison, I have sat on the federal bench for many years. In that time, I have presided over hundreds of cases involving law enforcement misconduct. I have seen good cops and bad cops. I have seen departments that worked to root out corruption and departments that buried it. He paused, letting his words sink in. You have a choice to make in the next few hours. You can be part of the solution or you can be part of the problem. I strongly suggest you choose wisely. His voice hardened. Because when the federal investigation is complete, and it will be complete, everyone who had a chance to do the right thing and didn't will face consequences. Morrison swallowed hard. I understand, Your Honor. Do you, I wonder? The viewing slot slid closed. Whitmore returned to his bench and he waited. Later that night, the FBI convoy arrived at the Western Hills Police Department. It was not a subtle arrival. 3 black SUVs rolled into the parking lot, followed by a mobile command unit, a large van bristling with antennas and satellite uplinks. The vehicles parked in formation and agents began emerging before the engines had fully died. Inside the precinct, chaos had been building for hours. Word had spread, not officially but through the whispered channels that existed in every police department. Something very bad had happened. Harlan had done something beyond the pale even by his standards. Federal involvement was imminent. The officers who were present at that early hour, a skeleton crew mostly, gathered in the bullpen speaking in hushed tones, casting nervous glances toward the front doors. When those doors burst open and SAC Marcus Lynch marched in at the head of a column of agents in tactical gear, the whispers stopped. Lynch was a striking figure, tall, lean, with the bearing of a man who had spent decades in high-stakes law enforcement. His dark skin was set off by graying temples, and his eyes had the penetrating quality of someone who had seen too much evil to be surprised by anything. He walked directly to the front desk, where a trembling junior officer sat behind the counter. I need Captain Morrison now. Morrison appeared almost immediately, emerging from his office with the haunted look of a man who had not slept and did not expect to sleep for some time. Agent Lynch, I've been expecting you. I'm sure you have. Lynch produced a sheaf of documents from his jacket. This is a federal search warrant signed by a United States magistrate judge. We are seizing all body camera footage from the officers involved in the arrest of Judge Whitmore, all dash camera footage from the patrol vehicle, all booking records, all personnel files related to Officer Vance Harlan going back to his date of hire, and all internal affairs records concerning complaints against Officer Harlan. Morrison took the warrant, glancing at it briefly. I'll have my people cooperate fully. Yes, you will. Lynch's voice carried no warmth. Now, where is Judge Whitmore? Holding cell 3. I can have him released immediately. You'll do nothing. My agents will handle the release. I want a clean chain of custody on everything from this point forward. Lynch turned to the nearest FBI agent, a woman in her 30s with short brown hair and a no-nonsense expression. Miller, release the judge. Get him to the mobile unit. Have a medic check him out. Document any injuries. Yes, sir. As Miller headed toward the holding cells, Lynch surveyed the bullpen. His eyes landed on a large man sitting in the break room, visible through the glass partition. The man was in civilian clothes, but his body language was unmistakable, the coiled tension of someone who knew he was in deep trouble. That's Harlan? Lynch asked. Morrison nodded. Lynch walked toward the break room, his stride unhurried but purposeful. The other officers in the bullpen parted before him like water before the prow of a ship. He opened the break room door and stepped inside. Vance Harlan looked up. For a long moment the two men simply stared at each other. Harlan's face cycled through emotions, confusion, defiance, fear, before settling on a sullen blankness. You're Harlan, Lynch said. It wasn't a question. I want my union rep. He's on his way. In the meantime, I'm going to give you some advice, free of charge. Lynch leaned against the doorframe, his posture casual but his eyes hard. In a few hours, I'm going to have every piece of evidence related to your arrest of Judge Whitmore. The body cam footage, the dash cam footage, the civilian recordings that are already going viral on social media, the booking records, the patrol logs, everything. Harlan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. When I have all that evidence, Lynch continued, I'm going to analyze it, and based on what I find, I'm going to decide how to proceed. He paused. Maybe you followed all proper procedures. Maybe this was a legitimate arrest that went sideways through no fault of your own. In that case, you'll be fine. Another pause, longer this time. But I don't think that's what I'm going to find, Officer Harlan. I think I'm going to find something else entirely. And when I do, you're going to have a choice to make. What choice? Harlan's voice was hoarse. You can cooperate. Tell me everything. Who taught you to operate this way? Who covered for you over the years? Who else in this department operates like you do? Give me the whole network, and maybe the federal prosecutor will take that into consideration when recommending your sentence. Lynch straightened up. Or you can stonewall, hide behind your union, pretend this was all a misunderstanding. His voice dropped. And I will personally make it my mission to ensure that you spend every possible day in federal prison. He let that sink in. The maximum sentence for civil rights violations under color of law is many years. For kidnapping, because that's what a false arrest is, legally speaking, it's even longer. For conspiracy, for evidence tampering, for whatever else I find when I start digging. He looked Harlan dead in the eye. You're looking at decades, Officer Harlan, decades. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. I've put away a lot of dirty cops in my career. You want to know what they all have in common? They all thought they were untouchable. They all thought the badge made them special. They all thought the system would protect them. Lynch smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. It didn't, and it won't protect you either. He walked out, leaving Harlan alone with the ruins of his certainty. Later that morning, while the FBI was still cataloging evidence at the Western Hills Police Department, the internet caught fire. Kayla Williams, the college student who had recorded the arrest from her second-floor apartment, had been awake all night. She had watched the footage on her phone, played it back many times, debated with herself about what to do. Part of her wanted to wait, to see how it played out, to let the authorities handle it, but another part of her, the part that had watched the video, that had seen the violence and the injustice and the casual brutality, knew that waiting was not an option. She had seen too many cases where evidence disappeared, where victims were discredited, where the truth was buried under layers of official denials and procedural stonewalling. She wasn't going to let that happen here. She uploaded the video to social media with a simple caption. Western Hills police officer beats elderly black man during traffic stop. No resistance. Full video. Please share. Within hours, the video crossed hundreds of thousands of views, then millions. Every major news network in the country had picked up the story. The video was devastating. Shot from a second-floor vantage point, it captured the entire encounter with remarkable clarity, the Mercedes gleaming in the rain, the officer approaching aggressively, his hand on his weapon, the driver stepping out calmly, hands visible, posture non-threatening, and then the violence, the grab, the spin, the slam against the car, the rough handcuffing, the lengthy search that found nothing, the arrest that followed anyway. And throughout it all, the driver's calm voice, audible even from across the street, explaining clearly that he was cooperating, that he was not resisting, that the arrest was unlawful. Comments flooded in from around the country, from around the world. This is how they treat a man in a suit driving a nice car. Imagine what they do when no one is watching. I've been stopped like this. They never believe we belong. They never believe we earned it. This cop needs to be fired immediately and then prosecuted. Where is this? What department? Names? We need to hold these people accountable. The pressure built like a wave. Social media activists, civil rights organizations, politicians looking for causes to champion, news producers looking for the story of the day. And then the story exploded even further. A reporter for a major Chicago newspaper, following up on the viral video, made a routine inquiry to the Northern District Federal Court, asking if anyone there knew anything about a Desmond Whitmore. The response came back almost immediately. Desmond Whitmore was not just an attorney. Desmond Whitmore was a sitting United States District Judge. The headline that followed crashed through the news cycle like a meteor. Western Hills officer arrested federal judge in shocking traffic stop. Vance Harlan, sitting in the break room of his precinct, watched the news coverage on the wall-mounted television, and for the first time since he had pinned on his badge many years ago, he felt genuine fear. The FBI's evidence analysis team worked with the precision of surgeons. In the mobile command unit parked outside the Western Hills Police Department, technicians connected hard drives to specialized equipment, their fingers flying across keyboards as data was extracted, copied, and verified. Chain of custody forms were filled out in triplicate. Every piece of evidence was photographed, cataloged, and secured. Agent Elena Miller oversaw the operation from the communications hub, coordinating between the field team and analysts back at the Chicago field office. "What do we have on the body cams?" she asked. A technician named Chen pulled up the relevant files on his monitor. Interesting, Harlan's body camera was manually muted right before he approached the Mercedes. The mute function stayed engaged throughout the entire encounter. "Deliberate obstruction," Miller noted. "That's a policy violation at minimum, consciousness of guilt at maximum." "It gets better," Chen said. "Western Hills uses a system that maintains an audio buffer even when the mute function is engaged. The camera wasn't recording video during the mute period, but it was still capturing audio from before the button was pressed." Miller leaned forward. "What did it capture?" Chen hit play. The audio quality was slightly muffled. The sound of rain against windows, the ambient noise of a patrol car interior, but the voices were clear enough. "Run the plates on that Benz. It's registered to a Desmond Whitmore. Address is up on Highland Crest." A pause, then, "You're right, a guy looking like that driving an expensive car in Highland Crest at this hour? He either stole it or he's dealing. I'm lighting him up." "Vance, the plates came back clean. No warrants, no flags. He hasn't committed a traffic violation. He crossed the double yellow line back there. I didn't see him cross the line. You need to get your eyes checked, rookie." Chen stopped the playback. "That," Miller said slowly, "is premeditated racial profiling on tape, with the rookie contradicting the fabricated traffic violation." "There's more," Chen added. "When we analyzed the dashcam footage frame by frame, the Mercedes never crossed the double yellow line. It maintained perfect lane discipline throughout the entire period it was visible to the patrol car's camera. Harlan's claimed justification for the stop is provably false." Miller sat back in her chair, a grim satisfaction settling over her features. They had him. Not just for the arrest of Judge Whitmore, though that would be damning enough, but for the deliberate lies, the fabricated evidence, the consciousness of guilt demonstrated by muting his own body camera. "What about the physical evidence from his patrol bag?" she asked. Chen pulled up another file. The technicians found trace residue consistent with multiple controlled substances, cocaine, methamphetamine, small amounts, but enough to suggest that Harlan had been handling these substances recently. "Drop bags," Miller said. "It wasn't a question. That's our working theory. He was carrying contraband to plant on suspects who came up clean during searches." The pieces were falling into place. Each piece of evidence confirmed and reinforced the others. A pattern was emerging, a pattern of abuse that stretched back many years, that had touched countless victims, that had been protected and enabled by a department that either couldn't or wouldn't hold its officers accountable. But there was one more piece to the puzzle. "The rookie," Miller said. "Parker Webb. He was there for all of it, and based on that audio, he knew the stop was dirty from the beginning. He's been identified as a potential cooperating witness. SAC Lynch wants to interview him separately, away from the union influence." Miller nodded. "Set it up. If Webb is willing to talk, he could give us everything. Not just this arrest, but the whole history, every dirty trick Harlan ever pulled, every time Webb watched it happen and said nothing." She paused. "And Webb himself has to make a choice. Does he go down with Harlan, or does he help us take down a corrupt cop?" The answer to that question would come soon enough. Parker Webb sat alone in a sterile interrogation room at the FBI's Chicago field office. He had been separated from Harlan at the precinct, driven to Chicago in the back of a federal SUV, and left to wait in this windowless room for what felt like hours. No one had told him anything. No one had explained what was happening or what was expected of him. He had never felt so alone in his life. The door opened and the woman walked in. She was in her 30s with short brown hair and an expression that gave nothing away. She carried a manila folder that she set on the table between them. "Officer Webb, I'm Special Agent Elena Miller. Do you know why you're here?" Webb swallowed. "The arrest last night." "That's right." Miller sat down across from him, her movements unhurried. "I'm going to be direct with you, Officer Webb. What happened last night was not a routine traffic stop. It was not a justified arrest." She paused. "What happened last night was a federal crime, and you were present for all of it." Webb felt his heart racing. I wasn't the one who..." Miller raised a hand, cutting him off. "I know. I've seen the evidence. I've heard the audio from the patrol car. I know that you told Harlan the plates came back clean. I know that you didn't see any traffic violation. I know that you tried to tell him to take it easy when he started using force." She leaned forward. But I also know that you didn't stop him. You didn't intervene. You didn't report the misconduct. You helped handcuff a man who had done nothing wrong, and you stood by while your partner searched his vehicle without cause. Webb's eyes dropped to the table. You don't understand what it's like. The blue wall, if I had... I understand perfectly, Miller interrupted. I understand that you were afraid. I understand that you were new. I understand that you were facing pressure from a senior officer who could destroy your career with a word. She slid the manila folder across the table. But understanding doesn't change the law. Right now you are facing potential federal charges as a co-conspirator in the deprivation of civil rights under color of law. That's up to many years in prison, Officer Webb. Her voice hardened. However, the Department of Justice is prepared to offer you an alternative. She opened the folder, revealing a document covered in dense legal text. This is a proffer agreement, sometimes called a Queen for a Day letter. It offers you immunity from federal prosecution in exchange for your complete and truthful testimony about what happened last night and about everything else you've witnessed during your partnership with Vance Harlan. Webb stared at the document. His hands were trembling. If you sign this agreement and cooperate fully, you won't face charges. You may even be able to continue your career in law enforcement, depending on how the state disciplinary proceedings go. Miller's voice softened slightly. But if you lie, if you protect Harlan, if you cover up what you know, the agreement is void and you will be indicted as a co-conspirator, tried in federal court, and very likely convicted. She looked him in the eye. You're a young officer, Webb. Do not throw your life away for a man who would gladly use you as a human shield. Webb looked at the document. He looked at Miller. He thought about his mother who had cried at his academy graduation. He thought about the pride in her eyes when he had pinned on his badge for the first time. He thought about everything he had seen over the past several months, the stops that had no justification, the searches conducted on fabricated pretenses, the Code 8 marijuana claims that were never real, the fear in the eyes of Harlan's victims. He thought about the man in the expensive suit standing calmly in the rain, his dignity intact despite everything being done to him. Webb picked up the pen. What do you need to know? Over the next several hours, Marcus Webb told the FBI everything. He detailed the Code 8 system, Harlan's method of claiming to smell marijuana to justify any search he wanted to conduct. He explained that Harlan had taught him that certain people in certain neighborhoods were automatically suspicious regardless of their behavior. He described the drop bags, the small baggies of narcotics that Harlan kept in his patrol bag ready to plant on anyone who challenged his authority. He named names, officers who had witnessed Harlan's misconduct and said nothing, supervisors who had received complaints and buried them, union representatives who had made evidence disappear. He painted a picture of a department that was not merely tolerant of abuse but actively complicit in it. And when he was finished, Miller looked at him with something that might have been respect. You did the right thing, Officer Webb. Webb nodded slowly. He didn't feel heroic. He felt exhausted, ashamed, relieved, and terrified all at once. But for the first time in many months, he also felt something else. He felt clean. The evidence mounted like a breaking wave from multiple sources through multiple channels. The truth about Vance Harlan emerged in devastating detail. The body camera audio with its damning pre-buffer recording of racial profiling, the dash camera footage proving that no traffic violation had occurred, the civilian videos capturing the violence of the arrest from multiple angles, Parker Webb's testimony exposing years of misconduct and cover-ups, the forensic analysis of Harlan's patrol bag revealing trace evidence of narcotics he had no legitimate reason to possess, and perhaps most damning of all, the personnel files, formal complaints over many years, separate incidents where citizens had accused Harlan of excessive force, racial profiling, false arrest, or harassment. Many times the department had investigated, and many times the complaints had been dismissed as unsubstantiated or not credible. The pattern was undeniable. The internal affairs files told their own story, investigations that lasted days instead of weeks, witness statements that were never followed up, physical evidence that somehow never made it into the final reports, a paper trail of deliberate negligence of a department that had chosen to protect one of its own rather than protect the public. S.A.C. Lynch convened his team in the Chicago field office conference room to review the findings. What we have here, he said, is not an isolated incident. What we have is a many-year pattern of abuse enabled by a department that failed at every level to hold this officer accountable. He pulled up a map on the large screen at the front of the room. Webb's testimony identifies at least dozens of prior incidents where Harlan used the Code 8 marijuana pretext to conduct illegal searches. We've been able to corroborate many of these through old dispatch records and patrol logs. Every single one involved a minority victim. Every single one occurred in affluent neighborhoods where the victim's presence was deemed suspicious based solely on their appearance. Agent Miller spoke up. We've also identified a pattern of civil settlements. The city of Western Hills has paid out millions in the past decade to settle cases involving Officer Harlan, settlements that included non-disclosure agreements and sealed court records. The victims couldn't talk about what had been done to them, and the city could pretend the problem didn't exist. Lynch nodded grimly. The question now is, how far does this go? Is Harlan a lone wolf, or is he part of something larger? Webb's testimony suggests it's larger, Miller replied. He named at least several other officers who operated similarly, though perhaps not as aggressively, and he described the culture of cover-ups that extended to the supervisory level. Then we expand this investigation, Lynch decided. I want a full pattern and practice review of the Western Hills Police Department. Everyone who signed off on those dismissed complaints, everyone who participated in the cover-ups, everyone who knew and said nothing. He paused, looking around the room at his assembled team. This started with one traffic stop, one officer who decided he had the right to brutalize a citizen based on the color of his skin, but it's not going to end there. We're going to follow this wherever it leads, and when we're done, the Western Hills Police Department is going to look very different than it does today. The team dispersed to their tasks. The investigation had only just begun. Several days after his arrest, Judge Desmond Whitmore returned to the Western Hills Police Department. He came not as a prisoner this time, but as a witness. The FBI had requested his presence for the formal processing of evidence, a procedure that required the victim to review and confirm certain materials. It was routine, bureaucratic, the kind of thing that could have been handled through written statements and video calls, but Whitmore had requested to appear in person. He wanted to see Vance Harlan one more time. The precinct had changed in the days since his arrest. The atmosphere of casual arrogance had been replaced by something close to terror. Officers spoke in hushed tones, supervisors jumped at shadows. Everyone knew that the FBI was watching, that every action was being scrutinized, that careers could end with a single misstep. Whitmore walked through the front doors in the morning, accompanied by SAC Lynch and 2 FBI agents. He was dressed immaculately, a dark blue suit perfectly tailored, a crimson tie that seemed almost to glow against his white shirt. He had not tried to hide the fading bruises on his wrists where the handcuffs had cut into his skin. He wanted people to see. The officers in the bullpen stopped what they were doing. They watched him pass, their expressions a mixture of shame, fear, and dawning comprehension. This was the man their colleague had arrested. This was the federal judge whose rights had been violated. This was the reason their department was being torn apart. Whitmore did not acknowledge them. He walked with the same calm dignity he had displayed on the night of his arrest, his carriage erect, his gaze focused straight ahead. He was led to a conference room where evidence was spread across a long table. Documents, photographs, printouts of video stills. SAC Lynch explained each item, asking Whitmore to confirm details and provide context. But Whitmore's attention was elsewhere. Through the glass partition of the conference room, he could see into the bullpen, and standing near the far wall, flanked by 2 uniformed officers who seemed to be serving as minders, was Vance Harlan. Harlan was in civilian clothes, jeans and a polo shirt, the casual attire of a man who no longer had the right to wear a uniform. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot, his posture deflated. He looked nothing like the swaggering predator who had slammed Whitmore against his Mercedes days earlier. He looked like a man who had finally realized that his world was collapsing. "Excuse me for a moment," Whitmore said to Lynch. He walked to the door of the conference room, opened it, and stepped into the bullpen. The ambient noise of the precinct died instantly. Every officer, every civilian employee, every FBI agent present turned to watch. Whitmore walked directly toward Harlan. Harlan's minders shifted nervously, but they made no move to interfere. They knew better than to get between a federal judge and the man who had violated his rights. Whitmore stopped a few feet from Harlan. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Harlan's eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape, looking for support, looking for anything that might save him from this moment. He found nothing but staring faces and deafening silence. When Whitmore spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the room. "Officer Harlan, do you remember what I told you on the night you arrested me?" Harlan's mouth opened. No sound came out. "I told you," Whitmore continued, "that what happened after that moment could not be undone. I told you that there would be no exit. I gave you every opportunity to walk away, to end the encounter, to return my documents and go about your business." He paused. "You chose not to listen. You chose to treat me as you had treated countless others before me, as someone whose rights did not matter, whose dignity could be violated with impunity, whose very presence in your territory was an offense to be punished." Whitmore's voice remained steady, almost conversational, but there was an edge to it now, a cold certainty that made the watching officers shift uncomfortably. "The difference between me and your other victims is not that I'm more worthy of respect. It is that I have the resources to ensure that your actions have consequences, resources that your previous victims lacked, resources that you counted on them not having when you targeted them." He took a step closer. "I want you to understand something, Officer Harlan. I'm not angry. Anger would suggest that what you did was personal, that it wounded me in some deep way. It did not." His voice dropped lower. "What you did was reveal your character, a character that has been allowed to flourish in an environment that rewarded brutality and punished accountability." Whitmore's gaze bored into Harlan with an intensity that made the former officer look away. "What you will face in the coming weeks and months is not vengeance. It is justice, the same justice that I have spent my career administering, the same justice that applies to everyone regardless of whether they wear a badge." He turned to leave, then paused. I hope for your sake that you use your time in prison to reflect on the choices that brought you here, on the people you harmed, on the damage you did to the very institution you claim to serve." Whitmore walked back to the conference room, leaving Harlan standing alone in the center of the silent bullpen. No one spoke, no one moved, and Vance Harlan, for the first time in his adult life, had absolutely nothing to say. The arrest happened at dawn several weeks after the traffic stop that had changed everything. An FBI tactical team descended on Vance Harlan's modest suburban home with overwhelming force. A Bearcat armored vehicle crashed through the front gate, its massive weight crushing the carefully maintained lawn that Harlan's wife had tended for years. Floodlights ignited the pre-dawn darkness, transforming night into harsh artificial day. Armed agents in tactical gear surrounded the house from every direction, their weapons trained on doors and windows, their voices barking commands through megaphones. "Vance Harlan, FBI, come out with your hands visible. This is a federal warrant. You have seconds to comply." Inside the house, Harlan jolted awake from a fitful sleep. His wife, Carol, screamed as the floodlights blazed through their bedroom windows. The sound of boots on the front porch, fists pounding on the door, shouted commands that left no room for misunderstanding. It all crashed together into a symphony of overwhelming authority. Harlan knew that resistance was futile. He had been on the other side of this equation enough times to recognize what was happening. This was the full weight of the federal government brought to bear on a single target with irresistible force. He stumbled out of bed in his underwear, his hands raised, his voice cracking as he shouted that he was coming, that he wasn't armed, that he was cooperating. The door crashed open anyway. Agents flooded into the house, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness like blades. Harlan was grabbed, spun around, and slammed face first onto the floor of his own living room. The same floor where he had played with his children, where he had celebrated Christmases, where he had lived the ordinary life of a suburban family man. "Vance Harlan, you are under arrest on federal charges including deprivation of civil rights under color of law, kidnapping under color of law, evidence tampering, and conspiracy to violate civil rights. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The Miranda warning continued, but Harlan barely heard it. His face was pressed against the carpet, his wrists being secured behind his back with the same kind of handcuffs he had used on hundreds of suspects over his career. Handcuffs that were, he now noticed, uncomfortably tight. Carol was crying somewhere in the background, her voice high and hysterical. Agents were moving through the house, securing rooms, documenting everything. Through the living room window, Harlan could see his neighbors emerging from their homes, standing in bathrobes and pajamas, watching the spectacle unfold. The humiliation was complete. When the agents hauled him to his feet, Harlan caught a glimpse of himself in the hallway mirror. A middle-aged man in his underwear, face flushed, eyes wild with shock and fear, being perp-walked through his own home by federal agents. He looked, he realized, exactly like the people he had arrested over the years, the people he had treated as less than human, the people whose dignity he had stripped away without a second thought. Now he knew what it felt like. Outside, the morning light was beginning to break over the horizon. A news helicopter circled overhead, its camera capturing every moment for the morning broadcasts. Neighbors' phone cameras recorded his march to the waiting SUV. Social media would have the images within minutes. Vance Harlan was loaded into the back of a federal vehicle, the door slamming shut with a finality that seemed to echo through his entire existence. His life as he knew it was over. The federal courthouse in Chicago was a modern building of glass and steel, designed to project the majesty and authority of the American legal system. Its marble floors gleamed under fluorescent lights, its courtrooms were equipped with the latest technology for evidence presentation, its security was tight enough to handle the most high-profile cases. The trial of Vance Harlan was very high-profile indeed. The courtroom was packed to capacity. Journalists from national news outlets occupied the press gallery, their laptops open, their fingers ready to report every development in real time. Civil rights activists filled the public seating, their presence a silent testimony to the broader implications of the case. Police officers from departments across the country watched via live stream, some with concern, others with grim satisfaction, and in the front row of the gallery, sitting quietly and observing everything, was Judge Desmond Whitmore. He was not presiding over this case. That would have been an obvious conflict of interest. Instead, the case had been assigned to Judge Carla Hayes, a stern woman in her 60s who had a reputation for running a tight courtroom and tolerating no nonsense from either side. The prosecution was led by Assistant United States Attorney Margaret Chen, a rising star in the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. She had built her career on cases like this, cases involving law enforcement officers who had crossed the line from protectors to predators. The defense was represented by Thomas Wright, a veteran criminal defense attorney who had made a name for himself representing police officers accused of misconduct. Wright was good. Everyone acknowledged that, but even he seemed to sense that this case was different, that the evidence was too overwhelming. The public attention too intense, the outcome too predetermined. The trial lasted several days. On the first day, the prosecution laid out its case in devastating detail. Chen walked the jury through the events of that rainy night using body camera footage, dash camera footage, and civilian recordings to paint a picture of abuse that could not be disputed. "You will see," Chen told the jury, "an officer who stopped a vehicle for no reason other than the color of the driver's skin." She paused. "You will hear him fabricate a traffic violation that never occurred. You will watch him assault a compliant, non-threatening citizen. You will witness him conduct an illegal search based on a lie he knew to be false." Her voice hardened. "And you will understand that this was not an isolated incident but part of a pattern that stretched back many years." On the second day, the prosecution called its expert witnesses. FBI forensic analysts testified about the body camera audio buffer, explaining how Harlan's own words had been captured despite his attempt to mute the device. Digital video experts authenticated the civilian recordings and demonstrated that the Mercedes had never crossed the double yellow line. On the third day, Parker Webb took the stand. Webb had aged visibly in the weeks since the arrest. His face was thinner, his eyes haunted, but his voice was steady as he described what he had witnessed during his months partnering with Harlan. "He called it Code 8, Webb testified. "It was his way of saying he smelled marijuana when he didn't. It gave him an excuse to search anyone he wanted, anytime he wanted. I heard him use it dozens of times. It was never real." Wright cross-examined Webb aggressively, trying to paint him as a disgruntled subordinate seeking to save himself. But the evidence corroborated everything Webb said: the internal affairs complaints, the settlement records, the pattern of stops that overwhelmingly targeted minority citizens. By the end of the third day, the defense was in tatters. On the fourth day, the prosecution called its final witness. Judge Desmond Whitmore took the stand with the quiet dignity that had defined his entire career. He wore a dark suit and spoke in measured tones, recounting the events of that rainy night with the precision of a man trained to analyze evidence. He described the stop, the aggressive approach, the fabricated marijuana claim, the physical violence, the handcuffs, the search, the arrest, and throughout his testimony he never raised his voice, never showed anger, never displayed the righteous fury that anyone in his position would have been entitled to feel. He simply stated the facts. When Chen asked him what he had been thinking during the encounter, Whitmore paused for a long moment before answering. "I was thinking about all the people who had been through the same experience I was going through but who didn't have the resources to fight back." He paused. "I was thinking about the teenagers stopped for no reason, the single mothers treated as criminals, the elderly men whose dignity was stripped away because they happened to be driving through the wrong neighborhood with the wrong skin color." He looked at the jury. "I made a decision that night to let Officer Harlan show exactly who he was. I cooperated fully. I did not resist in any way. I wanted to document through my own experience exactly what this officer was capable of doing to a compliant citizen." "And why did you do that?" Chen asked. "Because," Whitmore said, "I have spent many years on the federal bench. I have presided over hundreds of civil rights cases, and in every one of those cases there were officers who claimed the victim had resisted, had been aggressive, had provoked the confrontation." His voice strengthened. "I wanted to remove any possibility of that defense. I wanted the evidence to be unambiguous." He paused. "And it was." Wright's cross-examination was brief and ineffective. He tried to suggest that Whitmore had been uncooperative in not immediately revealing his identity as a federal judge, but the argument fell flat. As Whitmore calmly pointed out, citizens are not required to reveal their occupations to avoid being brutalized by police. That was the entire point. The closing arguments were almost anticlimactic. Chen summarized the evidence in precise clinical terms, letting the facts speak for themselves. Wright did his best for his client, arguing that Harlan had made a mistake in judgment, that he had been trained in a culture that encouraged aggressive policing, that he had not intended to violate anyone's civil rights. The jury was not persuaded. After a short deliberation, they returned with their verdict, guilty on all counts. Harlan collapsed forward onto the defense table, his body shaking with sobs. The courtroom erupted in murmurs and exclamations. In the gallery, civil rights activists embraced each other with tears streaming down their faces. Judge Hayes banged her gavel for order. "The defendant is remanded to custody pending sentencing," she announced. "Bail is revoked. This court is adjourned." As marshals approached to take him away, Harlan looked up one last time. His eyes found Whitmore in the gallery. The two men stared at each other for a long moment. Whitmore's expression was unchanged, calm, dignified, utterly composed. He had nothing more to say. Weeks later, Vance Harlan stood before Judge Hayes for sentencing. The courtroom was again packed, though the atmosphere was different this time. A sense of finality, of closure, of justice about to be delivered. Harlan had aged dramatically in the weeks since his conviction. His hair seemed grayer, his posture more stooped, his eyes carrying the hollow look of a man who had finally understood the magnitude of his downfall. His attorney had submitted letters attesting to his character. Letters from family members, from a few colleagues who had not abandoned him, from neighbors who remembered him as a good father and a friendly presence at neighborhood barbecues. None of it mattered. Judge Hayes reviewed the pre-sentencing report with her characteristic thoroughness. She noted the aggravating factors, The pattern of criminal misconduct, the abuse of authority, the racial bias that had driven Harlan's actions. She noted the absence of any genuine remorse, the attempts to blame the victim, the continued insistence that he had done nothing wrong. "Mr. Harlan," she said, "please rise." Harlan stood on unsteady legs. "You have been convicted of deprivation of civil rights under color of law, kidnapping under color of law, evidence tampering, and conspiracy to violate civil rights. These are serious offenses. They represent a fundamental betrayal of the oath you took when you became a police officer." She paused. "The evidence presented at trial revealed that your conduct on the night in question was not an aberration. It was the culmination of a many-year pattern of abuse enabled by a department that failed to hold you accountable and a system that protected you from the consequences of your actions." Hayes's voice hardened. "You used your badge as a weapon. You treated citizens you were sworn to protect, as enemies to be subdued. You fabricated evidence. You lied on official reports. You destroyed the lives of people who had committed no crime other than existing in your presence while being the wrong color." She looked at Harlan with an expression of cold contempt. "The sentence of this court is as follows: many years in federal prison to be served without the possibility of parole, followed by years of supervised release. You will also be permanently barred from serving in any law enforcement capacity for the remainder of your life." Harlan swayed but did not fall. "This sentence reflects the seriousness of your crimes and the need to send a clear message to law enforcement officers throughout this country. The badge is not a license to abuse. The uniform is not a shield from accountability. When officers betray their oath, when they use their authority to harm the citizens they are sworn to protect, they will face the full consequences of the law." She banged her gavel. "This court is adjourned. Marshals, take the defendant into custody." As Harlan was led away in chains, he passed within feet of where Whitmore sat in the gallery. For a moment their eyes met. Whitmore said nothing. His expression was calm, almost serene. He simply watched as the man who had tried to destroy him was led away to face his punishment. Justice had been served. Vance Harlan arrived at a federal correctional institution several weeks after his sentencing. The facility was a medium-security prison in Indiana, housing many inmates. It was not the worst place in the federal prison system, but it was far from comfortable. Concrete and steel, razor wire and guard towers, the absolute regimentation of every moment, every movement, every aspect of daily life. For a man who had spent many years wielding absolute authority over others, it was a particular kind of hell. The intake process stripped away the last remnants of his former identity. His clothes were replaced with standard-issue prison khakis. His personal effects were cataloged and stored. He was photographed, fingerprinted, and assigned a number that would define his existence for the next many years. "Name?" the intake officer asked. "Harlan, Vance Harlan." The officer looked up from his paperwork. Recognition flickered in his eyes. The cop, the one who arrested the judge. Harlan said nothing. "Word travels fast in here," the officer continued, his voice carefully neutral. "You're going to want to keep your head down. Ex-cops don't do well in general population." Harlan was assigned to a cell block far from the intake area. As he walked the corridor to his assigned cell, he felt eyes on him from every direction. Inmates stopped their conversations to watch him pass. Some glared with open hostility. Others smirked with anticipation. They knew who he was. They knew what he had done, and they knew that in here, in this place where power dynamics were determined by very different rules than the outside world, Vance Harlan was nobody. His cellmate was a large man named Johnson, doing many years for armed robbery. Johnson looked Harlan up and down when he entered the cell, taking in the soft hands, the bewildered expression, the obvious fear. "So you're the cop?" Johnson said. It was not a question. Harlan nodded. "Let me explain how things work in here," Johnson continued. "Out there you had the badge. In here you've got nothing. You're less than nothing. Every man in this block either hates cops on principle or has someone on the outside who was hurt by one." He stepped closer, his bulk filling Harlan's field of vision. "You want to survive many years. Keep your mouth shut, stay out of people's way, and pray that nobody decides to make an example out of you." That first night, Harlan lay on his thin mattress and stared at the concrete ceiling. He thought about the choices that had brought him here. The stops, the lies, the fabricated evidence, the countless victims whose names he had never bothered to learn. He thought about Judge Whitmore, standing calmly in the rain, warning him that what happened next could not be undone. He had not listened, and now for many years he would have nothing but time to reflect on that failure. The lights went out, darkness settled over the cell block, and somewhere in the distance a voice called out, "Hey, Officer Harlan, how's it feel to be on the other side of the bars?" Laughter echoed through the corridor. Harlan closed his eyes and said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Judge Desmond Whitmore returned to his courtroom days after the sentencing. When reporters asked him how he felt about the outcome, he paused for a long moment before responding. "The system worked," he said finally. "Not perfectly, not quickly, but ultimately and completely. Officer Harlan will face the consequences of his actions. The department that enabled him is being reformed, and perhaps other officers will think twice before they allow their prejudices to override their oaths." He declined further comment, citing the full docket of cases that awaited his attention. There was work to be done. The Western Hills Police Department underwent a transformation in the months that followed. Captain Bennett Morrison was promoted to chief, tasked with rebuilding an institution that had lost the public trust. A federal consent decree mandated sweeping reforms, mandatory body camera use, civilian oversight boards, enhanced training in de-escalation and implicit bias. Several other officers resigned rather than face investigation. 2 more were terminated for cause. The union contract was renegotiated to include stronger accountability provisions. It would take years to undo the damage that had been done, but the process had begun. Meanwhile, Parker Webb remained on the force. His cooperation with the federal investigation had saved him from prosecution, though it had cost him friendships and created tensions that would never fully heal. He requested a transfer to the Community Outreach Division, where he spent his days working with the neighborhoods that had been most impacted by officers like Harlan. It was difficult work, building trust that had been destroyed, but Webb approached it with a dedication that surprised even himself. He had been given a second chance. He did not intend to waste it. And on quiet nights, when he drove through the streets of Western Hills, he sometimes thought about the man in the Mercedes, the federal judge who had endured abuse with dignity, who had turned his own victimization into a weapon for justice. That man had shown him what true strength looked like. Not the swagger of a bully with a badge, but the quiet resilience of someone who refused to be broken. The rain fell on Western Hills as it always had, indifferent to the dramas of human justice, to the rising and falling of those who thought themselves untouchable. But something had changed in that affluent suburb. The patrol cars still moved through the streets at night, but they moved differently now, more carefully, more consciously. The officers inside them knew they were being watched, not just by cameras, but by a community that had finally found its voice. And in the federal prison in Indiana, a man who had once believed himself to be above the law learned, day by day, what it meant to live beneath it. The badge that had once been his crown was gone forever. All that remained was the truth that power without accountability is not power at all. It is simply abuse waiting to be exposed. Vance Harlan had many years to contemplate that truth, and Desmond Whitmore had a lifetime to ensure that others would never have to learn it the way he had. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you that justice, though slow, can still prevail, we ask only this: subscribe to our channel, share it with someone who needs to hear that accountability is possible, and remember, the only thing necessary for abuse to continue is for good people to remain silent. Your voice matters. Use it.